It was one of those unusually humid August nights in upstate New York, the kind where the air hangs heavy and sticky, and the cicadas drone relentlessly outside. I had just moved into a small, slightly rundown apartment on the edge of a quiet town called Millersburg, a place I chose for its cheap rent and proximity to work. The building was old, dating back to the 1930s, and had the kind of creaking wooden floors and drafty corners that made you double-check your locks twice before bed. I wasn't superstitious, not by a long shot, but something about the place made me uneasy. At first, I chalked it up to the noises older buildings always make. The pipes groaning, the wind rattling the window panes, the neighbors walking above me. But as the nights went on, the unease grew into a tangible dread. The first night, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I unpacked, set up my modest furniture, and fell asleep to the sound of a ceiling fan that barely worked. Around 3 in the morning, though, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. The floorboards above me creaked in a rhythm that didn't match any neighbor's schedule. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the sound persisted. Slowly, cautiously, I slid out of bed and approached the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, silent and still. I shook my head, laughing nervously, and went back to bed, though sleep refused me for the next hour. When I finally dozed off, I had vivid dreams of a woman in a tattered dress standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with hollow eyes. The next night, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They weren't random. They seemed to circle my apartment, sometimes stopping right outside my door, sometimes retreating to the hallway, only to return again. I called the building's landlord, an older man named Mr. Hargrove, who lived in the front office. He was gruff and dismissive, claiming the old building always made noises and that ghost stories are just for tourists. Still, he checked the hallway cameras for me. It was an old analog system, grainy black and white footage, but there was nothing there. No one. Not a soul. It wasn't just the footsteps. I started noticing small things moving on their own. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, were sometimes on the floor. Cups and plates shifted slightly when I returned from work. At first, I assumed forgetfulness, but the consistency and timing of it unnerved me. The most disturbing instance happened about a week into living there. I woke up to a whisper. It was faint, but I could make out words. Leave. Now. The voice sounded close, almost right in my ear, but there was no one. My heart hammered, and I froze in bed, too scared to move or even breathe too loudly. When I finally turned on the light, nothing had changed. The room was empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. By the second week, I was exhausted from sleepless nights. I began sleeping with the lights on, leaving doors open and keeping a baseball bat by the bed. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. It was soft at first, like claws scraping across wood, then louder, more urgent. I grabbed the bat, heart racing, and slowly approached the door. As I reached for the handle, the scratching stopped. I hesitated, then yanked the door open. Nothing. Empty hallway. But that's when I noticed the faint outline of a figure in the reflection of my mirror across the room. Tall, thin, impossibly pale, with hollow, dark eyes. It was standing behind me. I spun around, bat raised, but the room was empty. I backed into the corner, shaking, and stayed there until the first light of dawn. After that night, things escalated. I stopped trying to rationalize it. The presence wasn't subtle anymore. It began to interact in ways I couldn't ignore. Objects would fly across the room, doors would slam, and I could hear whispers in the dead of night, calling my name. I even started seeing fleeting glimpses of the figure during the day out of the corner of my eye, standing in the hallway, leaning against walls, sometimes in the living room, just staring. I became paranoid, pacing constantly, sleep-deprived, my nerves frayed. Friends told me I needed to move out, that maybe the stress was causing hallucinations, but deep down I knew it was something else, something real. One evening, desperate, I called a local paranormal investigator named James Carter. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and years of experience dealing with hauntings in the area. I explained everything, the footsteps, the whispers, the shadowy figure. He agreed to visit. That night, he set up equipment, EMF detectors, audio recorders, and a few cameras. We waited in the apartment together, lights dimmed, listening. Around midnight, the temperature dropped drastically. My breath became visible in the air, and the EMF detector started buzzing uncontrollably. James motioned for me to stay calm. Then, almost simultaneously, the footsteps returned. They were deliberate, circling the apartment, sometimes stopping right outside the bedroom. The recorder picked up faint whispers, so faint I could barely understand them, but James replayed it back. "Go away now," was clear. James tried communicating. "We mean no harm," he said into the air. "We're here to help you." For a moment, silence. Then a loud crash from the kitchen. James moved cautiously toward it. I followed. The refrigerator door had swung open violently and a plate was shattered on the floor. But the most chilling part was a message, scrawled in condensation on the fridge door. "You should have left." My stomach dropped and James exchanged a look with me that said everything I feared. This wasn't just a restless spirit. It was angry. It was territorial. And it didn't want me there. Over the next few weeks, the hauntings intensified. The figure became more distinct. Sometimes it would appear at the foot of my bed, sometimes by the kitchen, always watching, always silent. The whispers turned into low moans. At one point, I awoke to find the figure sitting on my couch, hunched over, staring at the floor. I froze, unable to move. It didn't approach, didn't speak, just sat there, a dark void of presence. Eventually, James suggested a cleansing ritual, a spiritual attempt to make peace. We tried sage prayers and various protective measures, but nothing worked. The figure seemed to resist every attempt, its anger palpable, almost sentient. The breaking point came one particularly stormy night. Rain pounded against the windows, thunder shook the walls, and I could hear the figure moving relentlessly through the apartment. I woke to a sensation of weight on my chest. I couldn't move. I could feel its presence leaning over me, breathing cold air onto my skin. Panic surged. I struggled, shouted, but no sound came out. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I bolted out of bed, drenched in sweat, shaking, my mind screaming at me to leave. That night, I made the decision. I packed my belongings at first light and moved out, leaving behind most of my furniture and everything I couldn't carry. I never went back. Friends who later visited the apartment reported strange occurrences: cold spots, fleeting shadows, whispers in the hallway. The landlord shrugged it off as old building quirks, but locals in Millersburg know better. They speak of the old apartment building as cursed, haunted by a woman who died tragically there decades ago. Some say she was killed by her husband, some say she committed suicide, but the stories always match. The hollow-eyed figure, the whispers, the malevolent presence that doesn't let go. Years later, I still have nightmares about that apartment. Sometimes I dream of the pale woman at the foot of my bed. Sometimes I hear faint scratching on my bedroom door, even here, miles away in a new apartment. I've tried rationalizing it, tried therapy, tried ignoring it, but the memories of those nights are so vivid that I can still feel her watching me. I tell this story not for attention, not for fear, but because it's true. I lived it. And anyone who has ever stayed in that building can tell you, it doesn't let go of the living. Even now, when I think of Millersburg, my chest tightens, my skin crawls, and I remember the nights I spent sleepless, haunted by something that shouldn't exist, by a presence that defies explanation, by a woman whose sorrow and rage still linger in the dark corners of that old apartment building. Story the end. It was the middle of October, the kind of cold snap that makes the edges of your windows foggy, even when the heater is on full blast. The leaves outside were turning shades of amber and rust, rustling in the wind like soft whispers. I was living alone in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston, a quiet area where most of the houses were decades old, some even dating back to the early 1900s. It was the kind of place where the streetlights flickered just enough to make shadows seem alive, and the nights were long and still. I had moved in only a few months earlier, drawn to the building because of the low rent and the fact that it was mostly vacant. The landlord had been vague about previous tenants, mentioning only that the apartment had been empty for a while and that no one had complained about anything. That had seemed fine at the time. I liked the silence, the solitude. But on that particular night, silence became its own kind of predator. It started around 11 o'clock. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, a blanket over my legs, scrolling through news articles on my laptop. The apartment was dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp near the sofa. Everything was quiet except for the occasional creak of the building settling. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. My heart stuttered because I live alone. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each step dragging slightly, like someone was unsure of where they were going. I froze, hoping it was just my imagination. But then came the soft whisper, almost indistinguishable, like the rustle of fabric. It wasn't words, not exactly, just a breathy sound, a murmur. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly standing up. The hallway was empty. My bedroom door was closed, my apartment door locked. I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize. Maybe a neighbor's door creaking, maybe the heating system. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of that. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on the laptop, but then I noticed the temperature had dropped. My breath started to fog in the room, even though the heater was on. That old, sudden cold that feels like it's brushing against the bones, not just the skin. I wrapped the blanket tighter, but the chill didn't go away. Then I heard it again, the whisper, this time a little clearer. It was a voice, soft, female, almost mournful, repeating a single word over and over, leave. My stomach dropped. I convinced myself it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe someone was in the building. I went to the door and checked the locks. They were all secure. Nothing. The street was empty, silent, the wind only occasionally rattling the window panes. I tried to shake it off and went back to the couch, but I couldn't stay in the living room. The feeling was oppressive, heavy, like the air itself was pressing against my chest. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the bed with my back against the headboard. My phone battery was dying, so I didn't even bother with looking at the news anymore. I just listened. The apartment had fallen into a heavy, unnatural silence. That's when I heard it again, not footsteps this time, but a dragging sound coming from the corner of my bedroom. My eyes shot to the dark corner where shadows pooled. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But then I saw movement, something black, thin, and human-shaped, but just slightly off. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs were too long, the way it slithered along the floor more like liquid than flesh. And then it stopped. I swear to God it was watching me. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move. I could only stare as it tilted its head, listening, almost sniffing. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached my ears, it whispered, "Leave." I bolted out of the bed, stumbling into the hallway. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment without even thinking about shoes or coat. I was halfway down the street before I realized I hadn't called anyone, hadn't even looked back. When I did, nothing. The building was silent, still, normal, like no one had ever been there. I spent that night in my car, parked under a streetlight 3 blocks away, just sitting and trying to convince myself it was some weird hallucination. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see that black figure, its long limbs stretching, its head tilting, and the whispering, always whispering, "Leave." The next morning I called the landlord. I didn't tell him about the figure. Not yet. I just asked if anyone had ever complained about noises or cold spots in the apartment. He hesitated. There was a long pause before he finally said there was someone, a woman who lived there a long time ago. She didn't leave, not really. Some of the neighbors say they say she never really moved out. I asked for details. He explained that a tenant had died in that apartment decades earlier. A woman, mid-30s, found dead in her bedroom. The cause of death was listed as natural, but she had been alone for several days before anyone discovered her. Since then, he said, tenants occasionally complained of strange noises, cold spots, and that some just left without explanation. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just an old building, bad wiring, and too much late-night reading of online ghost stories. I went back later that week to collect the last of my things. I had decided I wasn't going back to sleep there. When I walked into the apartment, everything was normal. Furniture in place, sunlight streaming through the windows. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the fear had built the hallucination in my mind. But when I opened the bedroom door, the temperature dropped instantly, like walking into an icebox. And there she was, not fully formed, just a shadow, a wisp of black smoke coalescing into a vaguely human figure. Her head tilted the same way I had seen her the night before. Her voice, soft and cold, whispered again, "Leave." I don't remember running out, only that I did, slamming the door behind me. I haven't been back since. I've read that some spirits linger when they have unfinished business, but this wasn't unfinished business. This was something darker, something that didn't want anyone there. Since then, I've moved several times, but every October, around the same time I first encountered her, I feel the cold, creeping sensation at night. The whispering returns in dreams, barely audible yet unmistakable. It's always the same word, leave. I've told friends, trying to rationalize it. Some say I'm exaggerating, others call it stress or sleep paralysis. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Some nights, when I lie in bed alone, I imagine that black figure slipping silently into the room, tilting its head, whispering, and I can't shake the feeling that if I ignore it long enough, it might find me again. People say ghosts are bound to places, trapped by unfinished business, anger, or tragedy. But she wasn't bound. She was waiting, watching, guarding the apartment, ensuring that no one could ever live there in peace. And in that realization, there's a terror deeper than any story can convey, because it doesn't vanish when the lights come on. It lingers in the mind, in the skin, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Some nights, I still drive past that building. I can't go in, won't go in. But I look at it from across the street, and if the wind is just right, I swear I can hear her whispering. Not just in my head, but in the space around the building, carried on the autumn air. Always the same word. It's a simple warning, one word that is pure intent, leave. And I do. I always do. I leave the area, the neighborhood, the streets, the building itself, even from my own memories sometimes, though they come back too easily. I can't explain why some spirits linger or why some attach themselves to the living in ways that are more than haunting, more than presence. I only know that she was real, that she exists, that she waits in the cold, dark corners of the apartment, moving silently, whispering. I've read about others who encounter spirits with messages, warnings, or simply reminders of mortality. But the woman from that apartment wasn't a messenger. She wasn't trying to teach me a lesson. She was a guardian of her own realm, a territory marked by her absence, her death, her existence folded into the walls. And when I think of her, when I try to rationalize the experience, the rational part of me fails. I still live alone, but I make sure to lock the doors to stay in well-lit areas at night. I try not to walk past that part of the city after dark, especially in October. And yet the fear remains, not the fleeting, jumpy kind, but the persistent knowledge that some things don't leave, that some presences wait patiently, that some whispers carry intent across decades and buildings. I've tried therapy, meditation, even hypnotic regression. None of it changes the memory, the sensation, the cold brush of air that feels alive and aware. None of it silences the whisper. And when I drift off to sleep on those restless nights, I imagine her figure waiting just out of sight, long limbs stretching along the floor, head tilted, voice soft but unmistakable. Leave. It's a lesson I've learned too late, and yet one I cannot forget. Some encounters don't end with a story, a moral, or a resolution. Some encounters leave you with only a warning that echoes long after the event, that lingers like a shadow in the corner of your vision, like a whisper you hear when you're sure you're alone. And that is what she gave me, the knowledge that she exists, that she watches, and that sometimes the only safe action is to leave. Even now, years later, on certain sleepless nights when the wind is just right and the shadows are long, I feel it. The weight of her presence, the icy breath against the skin, the whispered word that reverberates in the quietest places of my mind. Leave. And I do. I always do. Story the end. It had been a long week, and I was finally driving home from a business trip late Friday night. I always hated drive after dark, especially on the rural roads of Pennsylvania. The kind of roads where the streetlights stopped and the trees seemed to lean toward your car as you passed. I didn't mind the drive too much during the day, but night brought a sense of unease that never really went away. I had learned to accept it as part of life up there, especially after living alone for the past 5 years. I told myself it was just the isolation and the shadows playing tricks on your mind. But that night, nothing would convince me it was just imagination. I had left Philadelphia around 10 p.m., a little later than planned because of a client meeting that ran long. My GPS showed a route through back roads to avoid the highway traffic, but now I regretted it. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization there were. Every so often, I passed a farmhouse or an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been open in decades. The radio kept cutting in and out, static taking over for a few seconds before an old country song came back, then disappeared again. I blamed the storm clouds rolling in for the poor reception. I could see lightning flashes in the distance, though no rain had started yet. Around 11:30, I noticed a figure standing at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was someone hitchhiking, but the closer I got, the more it didn't make sense. The figure was wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, a long dress or coat that might have been from the 1940s. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a mannequin or some sort of roadside display, but there was nothing. No house, no sign, just the figure standing there under a lone tree. The hair looked long, dark, and wet from the mist forming in the air. My gut told me to keep driving, but curiosity made me slow even more. As I passed, I caught sight of its face. Pale, almost translucent, with dark eyes that seemed hollow. I thought I imagined it, but I felt it in my chest, a cold, sinking feeling that made it hard to breathe. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Just gone. I looked in my rearview mirror, half expecting it to be in the back of the truck or running alongside, but nothing. Just the dark road stretching behind me. I tried to shake it off as exhaustion and the storm clouds playing tricks with the shadows. I continued driving, but the atmosphere changed. The air in the car felt heavier, thicker, and the hair on my arms stood on end. My headlights illuminated the road in front, but shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, stretching along the trees like fingers reaching out. My mind raced, thinking about every urban legend or ghost story I'd ever heard about the area. Some said the old Pennsylvania back roads were haunted by travelers who died there, victims of accidents or worse. I laughed nervously at myself, trying to play it off, but I felt something watching me. Then my headlights caught something on the road. A small child, maybe 7 or 8, standing perfectly still, looking at me. I slammed the brakes, but my truck skidded slightly on the wet pavement. The child didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I honked the horn, expecting him to run off the road, but he didn't. I felt my stomach drop. There was something wrong with this kid, something not right. I leaned forward, squinting through the rain that had just begun to fall. When I blinked, the child was gone. No trace. No tire marks. No water splashed around, just the empty, wet road. My heart was racing, but I kept driving. I told myself I needed to make it home. My little apartment in Lancaster wasn't far, and the lights of the town would bring me some comfort. But no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched never left. Then I noticed my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, but there was a figure in the back window. I froze. It was a woman, her face pressed against the glass, staring at me. Her eyes were black, her mouth slightly open like she was trying to scream, but no sound came. I swerved to the side, heart hammering, but when I looked back, the seat was empty. My hands shook on the wheel, and I realized my breathing was shallow. I kept driving, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating. The road twisted and turned, and I knew I wasn't far from a small gas station I sometimes stopped at. But when I reached it, the lights were off, and the pumps were covered in rust. There wasn't a car, a person, nothing. The town's edge looked abandoned, like everyone had just disappeared. My GPS said I was still 20 minutes from home, but the road ahead seemed wrong. It looked unfamiliar, though I'd driven it dozens of times. I passed a bend in the road, and there, in the middle, was a horse-drawn carriage. No driver, no horses, just the carriage. My headlights illuminated it for a second before it vanished when I blinked. That was when panic set in fully. I wasn't just tired anymore. I was being followed by something I couldn't explain. I turned on my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The battery indicator was dropping fast. I tried texting my neighbor, thinking they could alert someone if anything went wrong, but no messages would send. The rain was coming down harder now, the windshield wipers barely keeping up. Then I saw them. Shadows along the side of the road, running, keeping pace with the truck. I couldn't see faces, just movements. dark shapes darting between trees, disappearing and reappearing. I slammed on the brakes, thinking I could lose them, but the road seemed to twist into itself. I wasn't on the road I knew. I was trapped in some twisted version of it. A sudden scream pierced the air. Not human, not animal, but something in between. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off every branch, every shadow. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, trying to get out. And then my headlights illuminated the woman again, standing in the middle of the road, but this time closer, her hair hanging in wet strands, eyes hollow and dark. She raised her hands slowly, pointing directly at me. My instincts screamed to swerve, but my truck stopped responding. The engine cut out, and the rain felt heavier, almost like it was pressing down on me. I looked at her face, and I could see her mouth moving, whispering words I couldn't hear. Cold seeped into my bones. I shut my eyes, convinced I would crash, and when I opened them again, I was on a different road. The rain had stopped. The road looked like a normal country road, lined with small houses and yards that looked lived in. My truck's engine roared back to life, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I sped up, trying to get to familiar streets. Eventually, I turned into my neighborhood. Lights glowed warmly in the distance, and I thought maybe it was finally over. I parked in front of my apartment and sat for a long time in the cab, trying to catch my breath. Everything seemed normal again. The streetlights, the quiet hum of the town, my building. I told myself I'd been exhausted, maybe hallucinating. I even laughed at myself, but when I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Cold, wet, decaying. My apartment door had been locked when I left, but the door to the living room was slightly open. I hadn't left it open. Heart pounding, I pushed it fully open, and that's when I saw it. The woman standing in my living room, eyes hollow, hair wet and hanging, wearing the old-fashioned dress. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could feel the room temperature drop. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. She raised her hand, just like on the road, pointing at me. And then slowly she began to fade, turning translucent, leaving only a damp, cold air that smelled like earth and rain. I backed out of the apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Not an hour. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. I stayed in my truck in the parking lot until sunrise. The next day, I told my neighbor what happened. She frowned and told me stories of the area I hadn't known. Old roads where travelers went missing, a woman who had died in a carriage accident decades ago, and children who vanished on rainy nights. She said people saw them sometimes, standing by the roadside, appearing in cars or homes. "You're lucky you made it back," she said quietly. "Most people don't." That was 3 years ago. I haven't driven those back roads nights since. Sometimes I still see her out of the corner of my eye, in reflections or shadows, or feel a cold breath when no one else is around. My apartment building has new tenants now, but I can't stay there for more than a few hours without feeling her presence. I've moved twice since, trying to escape the memories and the shadow of that night. But something about her, she follows. Always in the rain, always standing on the roadside, waiting. I've learned to never drive alone at night, never stop when I see someone on the side of the road, and still, every night when the wind picks up and rain hits the windows, I feel her, watching, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the creak of carriage wheels, the sound of a child's laughter far off in the distance, and I know she's near. I tell myself I'll never forget her face, that it's burned into my memory. But deep down, I know it's more than memory. She wants to be remembered. She wants to be seen. And every time I close my eyes, I see her standing there, wet hair clinging to her face, pointing, hollow eyes staring straight through me. The memory of that night never fades. It never will. And sometimes when the wind howls through the trees and lightning cracks the sky, I swear I hear her whisper my name. Story. The end. It was the kind of night that had a quiet, heavy weight to it. The streets outside were slick from an early spring rain that had soaked the sidewalks and left the air smelling of wet asphalt and damp leaves. I had been driving for hours, moving through small towns and stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever. My car's headlights cut through the fog that was rolling in off the woods lining either side of the road, and every few miles, the glow of a diner or gas station would break the monotony, but I wasn't stopping. I couldn't explain why exactly. I think part of me just wanted to keep moving, maybe to outrun the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. I had been alone for hours, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the wipers keeping me company, when I noticed the first sign that the night wasn't normal. It was subtle at first, a fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I told myself it was a trick, a tree limb swaying in the wind or a reflection off the wet pavement. But then I saw it again. This time I caught a glimpse of a figure standing on the side of the road, just past the trees. I slowed the car, squinting through the rain, but when I got closer, the figure wasn't there. I tried to shake it off and pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every curve in the road seemed to stretch longer than it should, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something there. A pale, indistinct shape that disappeared whenever I turned to look directly. Eventually, I reached a small town. I remembered passing through it years ago during a road trip, but it was late and nothing was open. I found a motel on the edge of town, a rundown place with a flickering neon sign. I pulled into the lot, hoping to get some rest before continuing my drive. The lobby smelled of stale cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. A woman behind the desk looked up as I entered, her expression neutral, almost too calm for someone working at a place that clearly hadn't seen many visitors lately. I asked for a room for the night, and she handed me a key without a word, just a small nod in the direction of the stairs. My room was small, the kind you'd expect in a cheap roadside motel. The bedspread was faded, the carpet had stains that looked like they'd been there for years, and the single lamp in the corner gave off a yellow, unsteady light. I locked the door, dropped my bag, and tried to unwind, but the unease from the drive hadn't left me. It started with small noises, the creak of the floorboards outside my door, a faint scratching that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a raccoon or something. But then I heard a voice, a whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it at first, coming from the corner of the room. Leave. I froze, straining to hear, but there was nothing after that. The room was silent except for the hum of the heater. My heart was pounding, and I told myself it was a dream, that exhaustion was messing with my mind. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched only got worse. Hours later, I woke to the sound of someone, or something, moving in the room. I sat up, listening, and that's when I saw her. Standing at the foot of the bed was a woman, her hair long and dark, her face pale and almost featureless in the dim light. Her eyes, if you could call them that, were empty, dark hollows. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I wanted to scream, to move, but I was frozen. Then she tilted her head slightly, as if curious, and slowly reached out a hand. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, before the instinct to survive kicked in. I lunged to the side, grabbed my bag, and ran for the door. The hallway was empty, but I could hear footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the rain. The woman at the desk wasn't there. The lot was empty, the neon sign flickering in the rain. I jumped into my car and started it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I drove without stopping, the rain blurring everything into a haze of lights and shadows. Every few minutes, I thought I saw her in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat or standing on the shoulder of the road. But when I checked, there was nothing. I eventually reached a highway that led to a larger city. The feeling of being hunted didn't leave me, though. I checked into another motel that night, and though I didn't see her again, I couldn't shake the sense that she was still there, just waiting. Weeks passed, and I told myself it was a hallucination, a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. But then I started having dreams. Not the usual kind, but vivid, waking dreams that felt like memories. In them, I was back in that room, and she was there, standing at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes staring straight through me. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, heart racing. It escalated over time. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. Doors would slam, lights would flicker, and I would hear the whispering, always the same word, leave. I started avoiding sleep, staying up for days at a time, just to keep her at bay. But the dreams followed me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night, I woke to find her sitting on the edge of my bed, her hand reaching out to touch my shoulder. I bolted upright, screaming, and for the first time, she spoke, her voice low and chilling. "You shouldn't have come back." I realized then that it wasn't just the motel. It had followed me. Whatever it wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to me, and there was no reasoning with it, no way to make it go away. I left my apartment the next morning and didn't return for months. I moved across the country, changed jobs, changed everything I could. For a while, I thought I had escaped, but the dreams never stopped. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, alone on a deserted highway, I see her in the distance, standing in the fog, waiting, and I know, no matter how far I go, how fast I drive, how much I change my life, she's still there, watching, waiting. I've tried to tell people about her, but they think I'm crazy. They tell me it's stress, exhaustion, maybe a lingering effect from that long, sleepless night on the road. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear her whispering my name. It's been years since that first night, but the memory is as vivid as ever. I still avoid motels, still avoid driving alone at night. But sometimes circumstances leave me with no choice, and I have to take the road. And every time I do, I feel the same cold, empty stare at the back of my neck, the same sense of being followed, of being hunted by something that isn't human. There was one night, not long ago, that I can't shake from my mind. I was driving through a rural stretch of highway in Pennsylvania, rain pelting the windshield, headlights cutting through the fog. I was tired, exhausted, but I had to keep going. That's when I saw her, just standing by the roadside, motionless. Her face was the same, hollow eyes staring straight at me. I slowed the car instinctively, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought I might break it. She raised her hand, pointing at me, and then the headlights caught her face fully. There was a smile then, faint but unmistakable, a cruel twist of lips that made my stomach turn. I floored the accelerator and didn't stop until I reached the next town. Heart pounding, vision blurred. I didn't sleep that night. I haven't really slept since. I don't know why she follows me. I don't know what she wants. But I do know this. She's real. I've seen her, touched her, heard her. And I know that she will never let me go. Never let me forget that night, that motel, that road. I've resigned myself to it, in a way. I drive at night less often, stay in busy, brightly lit places whenever I can, but the fear never fully leaves. Every shadow in the corner of my eye, every flicker of movement in the dark makes me jump. Because I know she's there, always there, waiting, watching. Sometimes late at night, I find myself thinking about that first motel room, that first moment I saw her. And I realize something even more chilling. If she had wanted to harm me back then, she could have. But she didn't. She's not after my life. She's after something else, something I can't understand. And that makes it worse. Because now I know that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, no matter how carefully I live my life, she will find me. And I will see her again, standing at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes staring into mine, whispering the same one word that has haunted me for years: leave. I don't know when I'll stop seeing her. I don't know if I ever will. All I know is that every time I close my eyes, every time I try to sleep, I feel her there. And I know deep down that she will be there for the rest of my life, a constant shadow in my waking hours, a specter that I can never escape. Even now, writing this, I can feel her watching, waiting, patient, eternal. Story the end. It was a cold, restless night in late October when I found myself alone in the old family cabin my grandfather had left me. I had always loved the place during the day, its rustic charm, the dense pine forests surrounding it, the way the late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows. But at night, the isolation felt heavier, more oppressive. The town nearby was small, only a few hundred residents, and the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. Most of the year, the cabin stood empty, and I only visited during weekends or long holidays. That night, however, I had decided to spend a few days alone, hoping that solitude would give me clarity on a few personal matters that had been gnawing at me. The day had been uneventful. I had unpacked my things, lit the fireplace, and prepared a simple dinner. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, making them groan and shiver. By the time night fully set in, the sky was an inky black, dotted with stars, and the moon barely peeked through the thick clouds. I sat in the living room, sipping coffee, listening to the rhythmic tapping of rain beginning on the roof. There was a stillness in the air, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I felt at ease, almost lulled by the solitude, until I heard it, a faint scratching coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I froze, straining to listen. The scratching wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, almost rhythmic. My first thought was that it was a branch scraping against the siding of the cabin, but then I realized the sound was inside. I set my cup down, my heart beginning to pick up pace, and slowly got up to investigate. I tiptoed to the hallway, listening. The sound stopped. I checked the bedroom doors. All were closed. Nothing. My rational mind told me it was probably just the house settling, an old wooden structure adjusting to the cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I returned to the living room trying to focus on a book, but every time the wind howled, it sounded like whispering. I told myself it was my imagination, fatigue playing tricks on me, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I turned off the lights, hoping sleep would come, but it didn't. Instead, I began hearing faint sounds, soft thuds like footsteps coming from upstairs. My cabin only had one story, yet the attic was accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. I never used it. It was mostly a storage space. I tried to ignore the noise, but then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate drag across the floorboards above me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the attic ladder, shining the beam upwards. The attic was empty, filled with boxes and old furniture, all covered in dust. The beam of my flashlight swept over the ceiling beams, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I closed the ladder, convinced that my imagination was running wild, and returned to the living room. I sat in the corner near the fireplace, trying to calm myself. That's when I noticed something strange. The fire, which had been steadily burning, began flickering unnaturally, almost as if it was reacting to something unseen. The flames warped and danced, and I felt an icy draft sweep through the room, though every window and door was closed. The hair on my arms stood up. Then I heard it, soft but unmistakable. My name. Emily. I jumped, dropping the flashlight. I didn't have anyone with me, and I certainly hadn't called out my own name. My hands trembled as I picked up the flashlight and swept it around the room. Nothing. The temperature seemed to drop, my breath visible in the beam of light. I backed toward the kitchen, my mind racing. There was a story my grandfather used to tell me about the cabin, something he never mentioned in detail. He called it the restless shadow, and warned me that some nights the cabin's past would make itself known. I had laughed at him as a child, dismissing it as an old man's superstition. Now I wasn't so sure. I sat at the kitchen table, trying to rationalize what was happening. My phone was in my pocket. I considered calling someone, but there was no signal. The thought of leaving the cabin in the middle of the night didn't appeal to me either, especially not in the pitch-black forest surrounding it. So I stayed, gripping the table edge as the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows violently. The noises began again, this time more pronounced. Footsteps, dragging sounds, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. It seemed to move through the house, from the hallway to the living room, then the kitchen, like it was circling me. Suddenly the flashlight flickered and the beam illuminated the far corner of the kitchen. My eyes widened as I saw a figure, faint but unmistakable, leaning against the wall. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her gaze on me, piercing through the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to respond. The air grew heavier, thick with a smell of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. The figure shifted slightly, and I realized she was crying, or at least making a sound that resembled crying. The sobs were quiet, almost melodic, echoing unnaturally around the room. I finally found my voice. Who are you? I stammered. The crying stopped abruptly. Silence. The room felt colder, darker. I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, like the air itself was trying to keep me from moving. Then, in a whisper, she spoke. Get out! The voice was soft, yet every nerve in my body felt its impact. I don't remember moving, but I was suddenly at the front door, fumbling with the lock. The handle turned in my hand, and I bolted outside into the cold night air. Rain pelted my face, the wind howled through the trees, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I slammed the door, locking it behind me, and sat there, shivering, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I didn't sleep that night. The rain continued, the wind carried on, and the memory of her eyes and her voice haunted me. I eventually drove into town at dawn, stopping at a diner to gather my thoughts. I told the waitress my story, half joking, half she nodded quietly and said, "You're not the first. That cabin, something happened there years ago. A woman went missing. They never found her. Some say her spirit never left." I went back home after a few days, feeling that I needed closure, or maybe to prove to myself that it was all a nightmare. The cabin was quiet when I returned, almost oppressively so. I unpacked my things, set the fire, and tried to sleep. Hours passed. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again. The soft footsteps, the dragging, the whispering. I froze, heart pounding. The flashlight was on the floor beside my bed. Slowly, I reached for it. The beam illuminated the corner of my room. She was there, sitting on the edge of my bed. Her head bowed, hair covering her face. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She lifted her head, and I saw her eyes. Hollow, dark, endless. She whispered again, "You shouldn't be here." I don't remember how I got out of the cabin this time. I only remember driving through the forest in the pouring rain, headlights cutting through the darkness, praying to reach the town. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I was shaking uncontrollably. The attendant looked at me with concern. I didn't explain. I just bought some coffee and sat in my car, trying to calm my racing heart. That night, I realized that some places carry their past in ways you can't rationalize. The cabin wasn't just old wood and furniture. It was a vessel for something unfinished, something that lingered. I eventually sold the property, unable to bear another night there, and the memories have stayed with me ever since. Every time I hear a creak in an old house or a whisper in the dark, I can feel her presence again, calling out, warning me, haunting me. Even now, years later, when I lie in bed during a stormy night, I feel the cold weight of her eyes on me, the soft whisper of her voice carried by the wind. I know she's still out there somewhere in the dark corners of that cabin, waiting for the next visitor, the next soul who thinks they can handle the night alone. And I can't help but wonder if she will ever find peace, or if she's destined to wander, sleepless and lost forever. I never went back, and I never will. And sometimes, when the night is especially dark and the wind cuts through the trees just right, I swear I hear her voice again, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. Story the end. It was just past midnight when I first noticed something was off in my small apartment in upstate New York. I had moved there a few months earlier for a fresh start after college, thinking the quiet town would be perfect for my writing. My apartment was old, a converted Victorian with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it had character, and I liked the charm of it. The first few weeks had been peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I chalked up the occasional unexplained sounds to the age of the building. That night, I had stayed up late working on a short story. The rain had started around 10, and the sound of it tapping against my window was oddly comforting. I finally decided to call it a night around 1, shutting my laptop and stretching before heading to bed. My apartment was dark, only the dim glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. I climbed into bed, feeling the warmth of the blankets and the steady hum of the radiator beside me. As I was drifting off, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the old wood settling, but then it came again, once, twice, 3 times. I froze, listening. My apartment was otherwise silent, the rain now a gentle background noise. Summoning courage, I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the dark. No response. I told myself it was probably my neighbor, though I didn't know anyone in the building, and eventually convinced myself it was nothing. Eventually, I got up, opened the door, and found the hallway empty. I shrugged, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, and went back to bed. It wasn't until a few nights later that things escalated. I was sitting in my living room, trying to read, when I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words but it was coming from the corner of the room near the window. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. "Hello?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Silence. I checked every corner, every shadow, but nothing was there. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to my imagination fueled by late nights alone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards above me. My apartment was on the second floor, and I lived alone. The steps stopped when I listened closely, and every time I convinced myself they were nothing, they would start again. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, but I felt an icy weight on my chest that sleep couldn't relieve. Over the next week, the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. Doors I had left closed would be open in the morning. Items on my kitchen counter would be moved or missing, only to reappear in odd places later. One evening, while making tea, I felt a sudden cold brush against my arm, like someone had walked past me. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. My apartment felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, as if it were breathing around me. One night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of someone calling my name from the living room. It wasn't loud, more of a drawl, a whisper that slithered into my ears. "Emily," it said. My heart pounded. I lived alone. I wasn't even supposed to have anyone in the building at that hour. I stayed in bed, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, but the voice came again, this time slightly louder, closer. "Emily, come." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Something primal inside me screamed that I should leave, but my body was frozen. The voice didn't stop until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. When I finally summoned the courage to get up, the apartment was empty. Everything looked normal, but the sense of presence lingered like a thick fog. A few days later, I confided in a coworker, someone I trusted, hoping to find some rational explanation. She listened and then frowned. "You know, that building has a reputation," she said. "The previous tenant died in that apartment. They said she was found in the living room, late at night, just gone. No explanation. People say her spirit never left." My stomach turned. I had heard nothing about this when I signed the lease. She told me the story of a woman named Margaret who had lived there for years. Her death was mysterious, sudden, and she was never found to be sick or in pain. It was as if she had just disappeared into the night. Locals whispered about her presence, about how anyone living in that apartment would hear her whispers, feel her cold, like she was still trying to reach the world of the living. After hearing that, I couldn't deny what I had been experiencing. I started researching more about the apartment, digging into old newspapers and online forums. Stories came up, late night knocks, footsteps when no one was home, doors opening and closing by themselves. One particular post chilled me to the bone. Someone described hearing a woman call her name, whispering from the living room late at night, telling her to come with me. I had heard the same words. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't move. I was terrified, but at the same time I felt connected, like I needed to understand her story. That night, I decided to confront it. I stayed awake, sitting in the middle of my bedroom with a lamp on, my laptop recording the room in case I needed evidence. I kept my phone close, ready to call for help if anything happened. Hours passed, the rain pattering against the window. Around 1:45 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. My breath became visible. I felt that icy weight on my chest again. And then I heard it. Footsteps in the living room, slow and deliberate. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay still. "Emily," the whisper came again, closer now, almost at my bedroom door. "Come with me." The words were soft, but each syllable cut through the silence like a blade. My hands shook as I gripped my laptop. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Something invisible brushed past me, a coldness so deep it felt like it seeped into my bones. I felt a tug, like someone or something was trying to pull me toward the door. I wanted to resist, but part of me, a small, morbid curiosity, wanted to know what would happen if I followed. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Who are you?" My voice was barely audible. Silence, then a sigh. It wasn't human. It was hollow, endless, carrying a sadness that made my chest ache. And then, in a voice that felt like it was crawling inside my mind, she spoke. "Margaret, alone, need." The whisper broke off as if afraid I wouldn't understand. But I did. She was lonely, trapped in that space, reaching out for anyone living in her old home. I felt a surge of pity mingled with fear. I wanted to help her, but I wasn't sure how. I tried talking to her every night after that, sitting in my living room, calling her name gently, asking questions. Sometimes the whispers would answer, sometimes nothing. It was exhausting, both mentally and physically, but slowly I noticed small changes. The coldness wasn't as sharp, the footsteps less frequent. She seemed calmer, or at least less aggressive. I realized she was not malicious, just a soul lost, tethered to a place she had known all her life. One night, after several weeks of this strange interaction, she spoke more clearly. Alone, scared, stay. I didn't understand at first, but then I realized she was asking for reassurance, for someone to acknowledge her presence, to make her feel remembered. I started leaving small things in the living room, an old scarf I found at a thrift store, a candle I lit sometimes, just little gestures. And slowly the manifestations began to fade. The knocks stopped, the whispers lessened, the cold no longer seeped into my bones. Eventually, life returned to something approaching normal. I still felt her sometimes, a presence, a whisper in the corner of my ear when I was alone at night, but it was gentle now, almost protective. I realized Margaret wasn't trying to harm me. She was simply there, a remnant of a life that had ended too suddenly, seeking acknowledgement, wanting someone to remember her existence. I stayed in that apartment for 2 more years. During that time, I never experienced anything violent or threatening again. I moved on with my life, eventually leaving the town for a new job in another state. Before I left a small note in the living room. You are remembered. You are not alone. I felt a calm presence as I locked the door behind me, a subtle warmth that I hadn't felt in months. It was like she had finally found peace, or at least some semblance of it. I never told many people about what happened. Most would have thought I was crazy, inventing stories to scare myself or others. But I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes when I think about quiet, rainy nights in that old Victorian apartment, I remember the way her whispers felt. Lonely, longing, and desperate for recognition. And I know that somewhere her spirit lingers, quieter now, content that she was acknowledged, no longer screaming into the dark void for attention. Even now, years later, when I walk into an old, empty house or hear a faint whisper in the wind, I pause. I feel the presence of someone who is there, not to harm, but to be remembered. And I understand, finally, the restless souls that haunt quiet places. They are not evil, not vengeful. They are lonely. They simply want someone to see them, hear them, acknowledge that they existed. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to listen, you can give them that small mercy. Story the end. I moved into the small old house on the outskirts of a quiet town in Vermont just as autumn was fading into winter. The house was a Victorian relic from the 1800s with creaking wooden floors, narrow hallways, and windows that rattled in even the mildest wind. I had found it listed online, a bargain for its size and charm, and I had been desperate to escape the city for a slower, quieter life. I didn't know much about the house's history, except that it had been vacant for several years before I bought it. The first night I spent there was unusually cold, despite the central heating system I had just had installed. I lay in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling above, listening to the wind whistling through the trees and the faint creaks of the old building settling. I had been exhausted from the move, and yet sleep didn't come. I chalked it up to stress and the new environment. But as I lay there, I became aware of a subtle presence in the room. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching me, waiting. Around midnight, I thought I heard a whisper. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, almost imperceptible, but there. "Why are you here?" it asked. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining to see if someone had entered the room. Nothing. The room was empty, the air cold and heavy. I told myself it was the wind, my imagination, or maybe the house settling. But even as I tried to convince myself, a shiver ran down my spine. The following nights brought more disturbances. Footsteps echoed across the floorboards when no one was home. Doors that I had closed would appear open. Objects shifted slightly from where I had left them. Sometimes I would wake up to find a chair facing the wrong way or kitchen utensils arranged oddly. It was subtle at first, but it grew more intense over time. The whispers returned almost nightly, fragmented sentences that seemed directed at me, though I couldn't make out the words fully. One night, I awoke to the sound of dragging footsteps across the hallway outside my bedroom. I lay frozen in bed, my heart racing. The steps stopped just outside my door, and then I heard the faint whisper again, almost directly in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted upright, flipping on every light I could find, but the hallway was empty. The temperature had dropped sharply, my breath forming little clouds in the cold air. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond my sight. Determined to understand what was happening, I began researching the house. I discovered that in the 1930s, a family had lived there, and their youngest child, a boy named Henry, had died under mysterious circumstances. Locals claimed the house was haunted, that shadows would move on their own and whispers could be heard at night. Some said Henry's spirit lingered, unable or unwilling to leave the house. I had dismissed it as folklore until I began to experience these events firsthand. One particularly long night, I decided to confront the presence. I stayed awake, pacing the living room with a flashlight in hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the familiar footsteps above me, just slow and deliberate. I climbed the spiral staircase, heart pounding, calling out, "Who's there?" There was no reply. A shadow flickered at the top of the stairs, just beyond the reach of the light, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I followed it into the master bedroom and froze. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, tall and dark, its features obscured. The temperature dropped further, and the whispers grew louder, almost coherent now. "You don't belong here. Leave." I fled the room, down the stairs, and out of the house, sitting in my car for what felt like hours, shivering. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it, though the heavy, musty smell in the house remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched. Over the next weeks, the disturbances continued. I would wake to find objects moved, doors unlocked, shadows shifting. I set up cameras and recording devices, hoping to capture something tangible. The audio recordings were unsettling. Among the normal creaks and groans of an old house, faint whispers emerged, sometimes overlapping, often repeating, "Leave, leave now. You see me. Always watching." I invited a paranormal investigator to stay for a few nights. He set up equipment and monitored the house closely. For a few nights, nothing occurred, and I felt a glimmer of hope. But one night, the monitors captured a faint figure at the top of the stairs, almost indistinct but undeniably human-shaped, staring down the staircase. Objects moved slightly on their own, and the temperature dropped drastically in certain rooms. The investigator admitted it was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. I realized I was dealing with a presence that was intelligent, aware, and territorial. It wasn't violent in a physical sense, but was possessive, resentful, and persistent. I attempted traditional methods to calm or remove it. Salt lines, religious symbols, even a medium performed a cleansing ritual. The medium explained that the spirit was confused, resentful, and bound to the house. Forceful removal could provoke anger. The only feasible option was coexistence, though she doubted it would be comfortable. One night in late November, the presence escalated. I awoke to find my bedroom door slowly opening. The room was colder than ever, and in the faint light, I saw the outline of a small figure at the foot of my bed. My heart raced, but I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't speak, but stared directly at me, its eyes dark, hollow, and accusing. After a long moment, it dissipated, leaving a thick, oppressive silence. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, fully clothed, clutching a blanket for comfort, but sleep did not come. I began documenting everything meticulously: times, sounds, appearances, and interactions. Patterns emerged. The activity peaked around the anniversary of Henry's death in late October, escalating from whispers to tangible manifestations, then fading slightly afterward. I began to understand the rhythm, the rituals of the presence, but it was relentless in its demands for attention. Months passed, and I grew accustomed to the disturbances, learning to live with constant vigilance. I no longer attempted normal sleep, instead sitting awake at night, observing, recording, and cataloging. I learned the subtle signs of its approach: a sudden drop in temperature, the musty smell, the barely audible whispers at the edge of perception. I accepted that I shared my life with a spirit I could neither understand fully nor remove. One night, a more direct encounter occurred. It was close to midnight, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of the heater. I heard a child's laughter echoing through the halls, soft and clear. I followed it cautiously up the spiral staircase to the master bedroom. There, in the center of the room, stood a small, translucent boy, his gaze fixed on me. He raised a hand slowly, pointing to the corner of the room where an old chest sat. The lock clicked open as I approached, revealing dusty toys and a small leather-bound diary. The pages were fragile, filled with the boy's handwriting, abruptly ending with a line that chilled me. "They are coming. I am afraid. I cannot leave." The boy watched silently as I read, and for the first time I felt a connection. He was lonely, trapped, and resentful, bound to the house by circumstances I would never fully understand. The outline shimmered and faded, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. The activity decreased slightly after that, though the whispers persisted, the occasional shadow flitting across the room, the furniture slightly displaced. Sleep remained impossible. I learned to live with the presence, accepting it as part of my nightly reality. Years have passed since I first moved into that house. I have relocated to a smaller apartment in another town, seeking peace, but the nights remain difficult. I occasionally feel the presence, subtle but unmistakable. A cold draft, a whispered word, a shadow at the edge of my vision. Sleep never comes easily, and I have learned that once you encounter such a presence, it never truly leaves. It follows you in memory, in the quiet of night, in the dark corners of perception. I live with the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows of old houses, in the creaking floors, in whispers at night, spirits like Henry exist. They watch, they wait, and they remember. My nights are forever altered. I have learned to accept it, coexist with it, and endure it, because fighting it only strengthens its presence. The sleepless nights have become a part of me. I have learned to listen to the whispers, recognize the signs, and respect the boundaries of the unseen. The house in Vermont still stands, and I am certain that Henry waits for the next inhabitant, continuing his vigil, bound to his home by forces beyond comprehension. Even now, as I sit in my apartment writing this, the wind rattles the windows and shadows stretch unnaturally long across the walls. I feel him again, the subtle brush of cold air, a whisper at the edge of hearing, the undeniable weight of being watched. Sleep is a luxury I no longer possess. I have learned to live in the presence of the ghostly, to navigate the sleepless nights with awareness, to respect what I cannot see. The nights belong not to me, but to the unseen who linger, patient and eternal. And I have learned this truth. Once you have glimpsed the world of the restless dead, the nights will never be yours again. The whispers, the shadows, the cold brush of presence, they become permanent companions. You carry them with you, and they carry you into sleepless nights, endlessly, relentlessly, until the end of your days. Story the end. It started on a damp, cold October night in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees like it's carrying secrets from the past. I had recently taken a job as a caretaker at an old farmhouse just outside a small town called Millfield. The property had been abandoned for decades, left to decay after its last occupants vanished under mysterious circumstances in the late 1970s. The owner, a distant relative of the original family, hired me temporarily to maintain the land and check the house for structural damage, promising I could stay rent-free. At first, it seemed like a dream, isolated, quiet, and cheap. But I quickly realized that the farmhouse was far from ordinary. The first evening was uneventful. I unpacked my few belongings, lit a fire in the old fireplace, and tried to shake off the eerie feeling that crept over me whenever I walked through the empty rooms. The house smelled of dust and old wood, and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls, producing sounds that were almost conversational. I laughed nervously to myself, attributing the unease to the isolation. I made a simple dinner, then went to bed early, exhausted from the long drive. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the faint sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were distinct, almost pleading. I could barely make them out, but they seemed to say, "Leave, leave now." I froze, heart pounding. The whispering stopped, replaced by a soft thump from the hallway outside my bedroom. Slowly, I got up, moving as quietly as I could toward the door. Peering out into the darkness, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, shadows stretching long and unnatural across the walls. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that the isolation was getting to me, and returned to bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, the unease continued. I explored the house more thoroughly and found remnants of the family's life, old photographs, children's toys, and letters strewn about. Each item seemed to radiate a history I could feel in the air. One photo in particular caught my attention. A family of four standing in front of the farmhouse, smiling, though the father's eyes seemed hollow in the fading black and white image. The back of the photograph had a handwritten note: "Protect them." I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a plea. That night, the disturbances escalated. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my room. They were deliberate, heavy, and unhurried, like someone was walking in circles. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the door. The hall was empty. The temperature had dropped significantly, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. As I shone the light across the room, I saw faint, fleeting shadows that didn't correspond to any object. I tried to speak, asking if anyone was there, but only a low, mournful moan responded, echoing through the house. I fled to the living room, hoping the fire would provide some comfort, but the fire flickered violently, as if responding to some unseen presence. Over the next week, the occurrences became more aggressive. Doors slammed without cause. Objects moved inexplicably, and the whispers turned into coherent sentences. "Get out! You shouldn't be here. They're watching." I could hear footsteps running up and down the stairs, but every time I investigated, I found the house empty. On several occasions, I awoke to find the bed sheets pulled off and the room in disarray, as if someone had been sleeping beside me. I began leaving lights on and even slept in my clothes, convinced that the farmhouse was alive with something malevolent. One evening, desperate for answers, I visited the local library in town, searching for any record of the family that had lived in the house. I found newspaper clippings detailing the mysterious disappearance of the father and mother in 1978. According to the articles, the children were found wandering in the woods nearby, life unharmed but traumatized, claiming that the shadows took them. Neighbors had reported seeing strange figures around the house, and the property had remained vacant ever since. I realized with a chill that the disturbances I was experiencing were consistent with the reported events from decades ago. That night, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. The whispers were constant, almost deafening now, and I could feel a presence pressing against me whenever I moved through the rooms. Around 3 a.m., the air in my bedroom turned ice cold, and I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was translucent but distinctly human, with hollow eyes and a mouth that moved, though no sound came out. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure raised an arm slowly, pointing toward the hallway. Summoning every ounce of courage, I followed its gesture and noticed a faint glow in the living room. I approached cautiously and saw the spectral forms of two children, holding hands and staring at a corner of the room. Behind them, an older woman, their mother, hovered, her expression one of deep sorrow. The whispers became clearer, almost pleading. "Protect them. Keep them safe. Don't leave." I realized that the spirits were not merely malevolent. They were trapped, bound by the trauma of their deaths, and they feared that anyone in the house could harm the memory of their family. The next day, I returned to the library to research any attempts at resolving the hauntings. I discovered that previous caretakers had all left abruptly, many citing terrifying encounters and psychological strain. Some locals suggested performing rituals to cleanse the house, but most advised against it, believing that disturbing the spirits could make them more violent. Feeling the weight of responsibility, I decided to leave offerings of flowers and small personal items in the rooms where the children had been seen. I spoke aloud, expressing my intention to respect their home and ensure their story was remembered. That night, the disturbances lessened. The footsteps were slower, the whispers gentler. I saw the children again, standing near the fireplace, and for the first time, they smiled faintly before fading into the shadows. The mother's figure appeared once more, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness mixed with gratitude, as if she acknowledged my presence and my intentions. I slept, for the first time in over a week, without interruption, though the air remained cold and the house creaked with the weight of its history. Over the following months, I continued to care for the farmhouse. The hauntings never fully disappeared, but they became less aggressive, almost like the spirits had accepted my presence. Occasionally, I would see fleeting figures in the windows or hear soft whispers calling out warnings, but I no longer felt terror. Instead, I felt a connection to the family, whose lives had been cut short, a sense of duty to honor their memory. In the spring, I moved out, leaving detailed notes for the next caretaker about the history of the house and the respectful practices that had helped maintain a fragile peace. Friends who visited the farmhouse reported feeling uneasy but not endangered, and I always reminded them to treat the place with care and acknowledgement of its past. Even now, years later, I dream of the farmhouse on certain nights. I see the children running through the halls, hear the whispers in the wind, and feel the weight of the mother's gaze. I know the spirits are still there, waiting, watching, and I carry the memory of that ghostly and sleepless period with me. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself writing letters to them, leaving them on my desk in case the spirits might somehow read them. It is a strange, haunting comfort, a connection to something beyond understanding, a reminder that the world holds mysteries that cannot always be explained, only acknowledged. The memory of those nights in Millfield stays with me, a mixture of fear, awe, and solemn responsibility. The farmhouse, abandoned yet alive, continues to stand in my mind as a monument to lives lost too soon and the enduring presence of spirits who never truly leave. I know now that some places carry the weight of history so heavily that the living cannot occupy them without consequence. And sometimes those consequences are terrifyingly, heartbreakingly real. Story, the end. It was a rainy October evening when I first realized that some places and some people never really let go. I was living in a small town in upstate New York, in a house I had inherited from my grandmother after she passed. The house was old, built in the early 1920s, and though it had been well maintained over the decades, it carried with it the weight of 100 quiet years. The kind of weight that isn't just in the walls or the floors, but in the air itself, heavy with memory and whispers you can almost hear if you listen closely. I had always been skeptical about ghosts. I'd read the stories, of course, but I had never experienced anything truly unexplainable until that night. The rain started in the late afternoon, a steady, drumming pour that blurred the edges of the world outside my windows. I had been unpacking boxes in what used to be my grandmother's study, a room lined with tall oak bookshelves full of old volumes and yellowed newspapers. The smell of aged paper and polish filled the air, comforting in a strange way, almost like stepping back in time. I set down a box of photographs and leaned back in the creaky leather chair, listening to the rain. That's when I first heard the faint sound of someone walking upstairs. I froze, listening. It wasn't unusual for a house this old to creak, for the floors to shift, for pipes to hum. But this wasn't a creak or a groan. It was deliberate, the soft scuff of shoes on wood, moving from the upstairs hallway toward the back of the house. I reminded myself that the previous tenants had moved their furniture out recently, that it was empty, that there should be no one else here. My heart started to race. I called out, "Hello?" The sound of my voice seemed to vanish in the room, swallowed by the rain. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and headed to the staircase. The steps groaned under my weight, each one protesting as if warning me to turn back. Halfway up, the footsteps stopped. My hand shook on the banister. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, maybe the wind rattling the windows. But when I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway was empty. The bedrooms were empty. The attic door was closed. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the faint smell of perfume, something floral and old-fashioned lingering in the air. I went back downstairs, trying to brush it off. I told myself I was imagining things, that moving into a house like this after living in a modern apartment would make my mind tricks. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing, but the unease settled in my chest like a stone. It wasn't until the storm grew heavier, the rain hammering the windows and the wind howling through the trees, that I realized the lights had started to flicker. Not the usual flicker from an old wiring system, but a rhythmic pulse, almost like someone was manipulating them. I walked to the fuse box, my flashlight cutting through the darkened rooms, and everything seemed normal. The breakers were all in place, yet the lights continued to flicker. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft and deliberate, coming from the living room. "Why are you here?" I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The living room was empty. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the fireplace cold. The voice came again, closer this time, almost directly behind me. Why are you here? I bolted toward the kitchen, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but it had no signal. I tried the landline, the same result. And then I heard the sound of glass shattering from the dining room. I froze. The old chandelier had fallen, swinging slightly, though no one had touched it. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my legs trembling. Something in the room was watching me. Something that didn't belong. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, huddled by the counter with a knife in my hand, listening. Every few minutes I heard it. Soft footsteps, whispers, the faint dragging of something across the floor. The rain outside seemed to echo the movements inside, like the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting, and watching. I stayed there until dawn, too terrified to move, too alert to sleep. The next morning, the house was silent, completely ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But the fear lingered. I couldn't shake it. That week, I tried to go about my life, unpacking, organizing, cleaning. But every night, as soon as darkness fell and the house grew quiet, I felt the presence again. Always just on the edge of perception, always whispering, moving, watching. I began to notice patterns. Footsteps always starting in the study, moving slowly toward the bedrooms, doors opening slightly when I wasn't near them, cold spots that followed me from room to room. One evening, I was sitting on the porch trying to smoke a cigarette and convince myself I was losing my mind. That's when an old neighbor came by, Mrs. Callahan, a woman in her 70s who had known my grandmother for decades. She stopped in front of the porch, peering at me with sharp eyes. "You shouldn't be alone in that house at night," she said. I laughed nervously. "It's fine. Old houses make noises. I've lived in worse." She shook her head. "You don't understand. She's still there. She never left. You need to respect it, or she'll make sure you don't leave either." I didn't know what to say. I tried to get more information, but she wouldn't elaborate. She just warned me again to leave before nightfall. I thanked her and went back inside, unsure if she more to scare me, if she had really experienced something herself. That night, the whispers were louder. I could hear footsteps pacing above me, slow and methodical, circling the entire upstairs. I called out, hoping to reason with whoever, or whatever it was. "I'm not here to hurt you." The answer came in a voice as clear as if someone was standing beside me. "You are here. That is enough." By midnight, the temperature had dropped drastically. My breath was visible in the kitchen as I tried to make sense of the events. Objects began to move on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, books tumbling from shelves, the chandelier above my head swaying violently. Panic overtook me. I ran upstairs, thinking to confront the source, but the hallway was a corridor of shadows stretching unnaturally, bending the light from my flashlight. In the master bedroom, I saw her. Not fully corporeal, but a silhouette, a thin woman in a long dress, translucent yet solid enough to feel the room's air change around her. Her head was bowed slightly, her hands folded as if in mourning. I froze. She lifted her head slowly, and her eyes, though faint, hollow, and dark, locked onto mine. "You do not belong here," she said. I screamed and bolted down the stairs. The entire house seemed to respond to my panic. The floors creaking underfoot, doors slamming, windows rattling. I grabbed my coat, my keys, anything I could use, and ran outside into the rain. The cold rain mixed with my tears as I sprinted to my car. From the driveway, I looked back at the house. The living room windows were dark, silent, but I could swear I saw her standing at the second-floor window, watching me leave. I didn't return for days. When I finally summoned the courage, I went back to retrieve some belongings. Everything was in its place, the house ordinary in daylight. But as I touched the door handle to leave, I felt it. A cold, heavy pressure pressing against my chest. A whisper in my ear. "You cannot leave." I ran again. I never looked back. I spent nights in motels, too afraid to sleep in my own bed, listening to every creak, every shadow, every sound. The dreams followed me too. Dark hallways, whispers, dragging feet, the scent of old perfume. Always the same woman, always the same warning. I eventually sold the house to a young couple, trying to warn them. They laughed at my stories, reassured me that old houses are prone to noises and drafts. But I knew better. Years later, I drove past the town and saw the house. The windows were dark, the porch empty, but I felt it again, a presence lingering, waiting, patient. Some things, some people never truly leave. They remain in the spaces they claimed, in the air, in the walls, in the silence. Even now, on nights when the wind howls and the rain taps against the windows, I feel her. I hear her whispers in the corners of my mind. You cannot leave. The memory of her face, her hollow eyes, her mournful intent is something that never fades. Some encounters with the dead are brief, fleeting, or explainable. Some stay, lingering, patient, waiting for the living to recognize that they are not the ones in control. I have learned to respect the warnings, to heed the whispers. I avoid old houses, quiet streets, the shadows that seem too long, the creaks that seem too deliberate. But I know, deep down, that no matter how far I run, no matter how many nights I spend in the city or in brightly lit motels, she is out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes when the rain is heavy and the night is silent, I can almost hear her voice again, soft but insistent. You do not belong here. It is a lesson I carry every day. Some ghosts are tethered by tragedy, by anger, by unfinished business. Some are tethered by memory, by desire, by the weight of their own existence. And some are simply waiting. Waiting for you to understand, waiting for you to respect them, waiting for you to leave. Even now as I write this, I feel it. The memory of that night, that storm, that figure is vivid in every sense. I can smell the old perfume, feel the cold brush of air, hear the dragging footsteps, feel the weight of her presence. And though I have never returned, though I never will, I know she is still there, waiting for the next person to cross the threshold, waiting to remind anyone who dares enter. Some places are not meant for the living, and some warnings must be heeded. I cannot forget her, and I will never forget that night. The night when I realized that some spirits, some presences, some fragments of the past do not rest. They linger, they haunt, they watch, and they ensure that the living never feel safe, never feel fully alone, never forget that there is always someone or something still there. Story the end. It was a cold October night when I first experienced something that would change the way I viewed the world forever. I had been living alone in a small rented house on the outskirts of a town in upstate New York for about 6 months. I'd moved there for work, an assignment that required me to be close to a historical archive downtown, but I had never really gotten used to the isolation. The house itself was charming, an old Victorian with creaking floors, high ceilings, and narrow, winding staircases that seemed to groan under their own age. My friends back in the city had warned me about living alone in such a place, especially as the nights grew longer and the wind started to howl through the cracks in the windows. But I laughed it off. I was a practical man. Ghosts weren't real, or at least that's what I told myself. It started subtly, with noises that could be easily explained. The first time I heard it, I was sitting at the kitchen table working on a report for my job. The old house had a tendency to make odd noises. The floors would creak, the pipes would groan, the wind would whistle through the gaps in the siding. But this was different. It sounded like someone walking up the staircase. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just above the floorboards. I paused, thinking perhaps it was my cat, though she was curled up asleep in the corner. The sound continued, moving from the base of the stairs to the hallway above my bedroom. I called out, "Hello," and my voice echoed back at me in the empty house. Silence followed. I went upstairs to check, but there was nothing. My heart was pounding, but I shrugged it off as fatigue. Over the next few nights, the incidents became more frequent. Objects in my home seemed to move when I wasn't looking. A book would be on the coffee table one moment and on the floor the next. My keys, which I always left in the same dish by the door, would occasionally vanish, only to reappear on the kitchen counter or once on the windowsill in my bedroom. I convinced myself it was absent-mindedness, my own carelessness. But then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, just at the edge of hearing, almost like the wind carrying voices through the open window. I'd be in the living room reading, and I'd hear someone murmuring my name. "Ethan." A soft, drawn-out whisper. I froze every time, straining to hear, but no one was there. My cat would hiss and arch her back, staring at empty corners as if seeing something I couldn't. I began keeping a voice recorder on at night, hoping to capture something that I could rationally explain. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I fell asleep on the couch with the television on. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a chill in the air. My breath was visible, though the heater had been running. The room was dark, except for the muted blue light from the TV. That's when I saw her. At the edge of the living room, near the staircase, there was a figure, a woman, pale and thin, wearing a long, flowing dress that seemed old-fashioned, like something from the 1800s. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in front of her face. She was staring at me, but it was impossible to make out her eyes. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't move. She lifted a hand slowly, beckoning me toward her. The instinct to run overtook everything else. I bolted past her, up the stairs, and slammed my bedroom door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in my bed, heart racing, listening to the house settle, every groan and creak making me flinch. That was the first time I truly feared staying in my own home. The following days were filled with unease. I avoided the living room after dark, ate my meals in the kitchen, and tried to rationalize everything. But the sightings continued. The woman would appear at random times, standing in corners, peeking from behind doors, or just in the middle of rooms, silent and observing. Sometimes she was accompanied by shadows, movements at the corner of my vision that would vanish when I turned to look. One night, the activity escalated. I was working late on some documents when I heard a loud thump upstairs, followed by the sound of dragging. It came from my bedroom. I froze, my pen slipping from my hand. The dragging continued, slow and methodical, like something or someone was moving across the floor. My heart raced uncontrollably. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the couch for emergencies and slowly made my way upstairs. The moment I reached the top of the stairs, the temperature dropped drastically. My breath came out in visible clouds, even though it was a warm autumn evening. The bedroom door creaked open on its own, and I saw her, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes black voids, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but no words came. Then the whispers, louder now, almost intelligible. "Leave. Now." I didn't wait to see more. I ran out of the house into the cool night air. I drove to a nearby 24-hour diner and stayed there until sunrise, watching the darkened silhouette of my home from the parking lot. I thought about moving immediately, but something held me back. Part curiosity, part the disbelief that what I had seen was real. I began researching the history of my house and the town. What I discovered was unsettling. The house was built in 1872 and had been home to several families, none of whom stayed very long. Newspaper archives mentioned a series of deaths and disappearances in the area, mostly women and children. One story in particular caught my attention. A young woman named Margaret, who lived in my house in the late 1800s, had disappeared one night during a violent storm. Her body was never found. Locals claimed she had been cursed, doomed to wander the house she loved, forever searching for something or someone. After learning this, I understood why she appeared in that dress, pale and sorrowful, but knowledge did not bring comfort. It only confirmed my worst fears. I began documenting everything, trying to make sense of it, and I found that the presence became more aggressive the more I focused on it. She would slam doors, rattle windows, and occasionally leave wet footprints on the hardwood floors, though there was no rain inside. One evening after another sighting, I decided to confront her. I spoke aloud, hoping to communicate, though I had no idea what to say. "Margaret, what do you want? Why are you here?" My voice trembled. The temperature dropped again, and she appeared at the top of the stairs, her hand raised slowly, pointing toward the hallway. I followed her gaze to the basement door. Something inside me told me that if I went down, I would see the truth. I gathered my courage and descended the stairs. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay. The light from my flashlight flickered. That's when I saw the wall. Marks, scratches, almost claw-like, and what appeared to be old, dried blood. I realized with horror that this was the last place she had been seen. And then I understood. She wasn't just haunting the house randomly. She was trapped here, bound by something terrible that had happened long ago. From that night on, the activity intensified. I could feel her presence constantly, especially at night. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, objects shifted, and I would often wake to find the front door wide open, even though I had locked it before bed. Friends who visited refused to stay overnight, and some swore they saw her too, always in the same dress, always staring. Desperate, I contacted a local historian and a paranormal investigator. The investigator, a man in his 50s who had studied hauntings for decades, listened patiently as I recounted the events. He didn't dismiss me, which was rare, and suggested a cleansing ritual. We performed it together in the house on a night when the moon was new. Candles, incense, and spoken words, traditional methods meant to release spirits. For a while, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, and I didn't see her for several weeks. But then one night, she returned. More solid, more intense. It wasn't just the appearance anymore. It was the feeling of being suffocated, of an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I began to fear sleep. I would stay awake for hours, watching the corners of rooms, listening for her whispers, her soft, mournful cries. I learned that ghosts, if they are real, are patient. They wait, they observe, and sometimes they grow restless if they feel ignored. Eventually, I made the difficult decision to leave the house. I sold my belongings, packed my things, and moved to a small apartment in the city. The moment I drove away, a sense of relief washed over me. I told myself that distance would keep her away, that maybe she would finally rest. But she didn't disappear entirely. Occasionally in the dead of night, I would see her in reflections, in mirrors, or in the shadows outside my window. I would hear my name whispered on the wind. And though I try to live a normal life, I cannot escape the feeling that she is always watching, waiting for me to return. I have since learned to respect the stories of others who have encountered the supernatural. I never thought I would believe, but the events of that house changed me. Ghosts, I have come to understand, are not always malevolent, but they are persistent. And some, like Margaret, are bound by events too tragic to release them. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming sensation that someone is standing at the foot of my bed. I tell myself it's a dream, a product of memory and fear, but deep down, I know better. She hasn't left me, and I fear she never will. Story the end. It started on a cold March evening in upstate New York. I had just finished my shift at the diner in a small town called Millersville, a place so quiet that even the wind seemed hesitant to blow too hard. The streets were mostly empty, the only lights coming from a few houses and the flickering neon sign of the diner. I was tired, bone-deep tired, and all I wanted was to get home, which meant a 30-minute drive along country roads bordered by forests that had a way of swallowing light and sound. I was driving my old pickup, windows cracked to let in some of the cool air, when I first noticed it. A figure standing by the side of the road. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I was certain it was a person. My first thought was a hitchhiker, which was unusual for this part of the country, especially at night. I slowed the truck, feeling an odd chill creep up my spine despite the spring air. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like a long, tattered dress, pale and almost glowing in the dim light of the truck's headlights. Her hair was long, black, hanging in tangled strands over her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't gesture, just stood there staring. Her eyes, I swear, were empty, like dark pits. I hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter. Something about her didn't feel right. Before I could make a decision, she stepped back, just out of the reach of the headlights, and vanished into the trees. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it, but the chill that ran down my spine said otherwise. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, glancing nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the bed of the truck. I got inside my apartment, locked the door, and tried to shake it off, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, watching, waiting. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening. It started subtly. I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, even though I lived alone. Doors would creak open on their own, lights would flicker, and sometimes when I was sitting in my living room, I would feel a presence near me, like someone was standing just behind my chair. The most unnerving experiences were the dreams, or what felt like dreams at first. I would wake in the middle of the night to find the woman standing in my room. Sometimes she was at the foot of the bed, sometimes by the window, her hollow eyes staring directly at me. I could feel her gaze even when my eyes were closed. She never spoke, but the terror she inspired was enough to make my heart pound in my chest. One night, the experiences escalated. I woke to find her sitting on the edge of my bed, her hands resting on her knees. I froze, unable to move or scream. She leaned forward slightly, tilting her head, and then whispered a single word, low and cold, "Leave." I bolted upright, gasping for air, and she was gone. But the room still felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was watching me. I tried rational explanations, stress, exhaustion, maybe a combination of both. But rational thought offered no comfort. Even in broad daylight, I would catch glimpses of her in the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. My friends started noticing changes in my behavior, my paranoia, my jumpiness, but when I tried to tell them about what was happening, I couldn't articulate it. No one would believe me. The breaking point came one night when I decided to confront her. I was lying in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to the usual creaks and whispers. After hours of silence, I called out, voice shaking, "Who are you? What do you want?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the air in the room seemed to grow colder, and I heard a soft, almost melodic laugh. I opened my eyes to find her standing there, closer than ever. Her face was clearer now, but still hollow, like something had drained the life from her features. She raised her hand, pointing at me, and repeated the word from before, "Leave." I didn't argue. I packed a bag and left my apartment that night, driving aimlessly, unsure of where to go. I ended up in another small town far from Millersville and checked into a motel. The woman didn't appear immediately, but I felt her presence, subtle and unrelenting, pressing on me even as I tried to sleep. Over the next few months, I moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. But no matter where I went, the experiences followed. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Whispers called my name in the dark, and every so often, I would see her standing just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I tried everything, counseling, meditation, even contacting a local priest for guidance, but nothing worked. She wasn't a figment of my imagination, nor a poltergeist tied to a place. She was tied to me, somehow, and nothing I could do would make her leave. One evening I was driving through a rural stretch of highway in Pennsylvania. The rain was falling heavily, windshield wipers working overtime, tacked there when I saw her again. She stood at the side of the road, motionless, dress clinging to her frame in the downpour. Her eyes locked on mine, hollow and endless. I slowed instinctively, hands tight on the wheel, and she raised a hand, as if beckoning. I pressed the accelerator and didn't stop until I reached a small town several miles ahead. The memory of that night haunts me to this day. I still see her sometimes, in fleeting glimpses on rainy nights, in the shadows of alleyways, in reflections that shouldn't exist. Every time she is the same, pale, hollow-eyed, waiting. Years have passed since that first sighting, but I haven't escaped. I avoid driving alone at night, avoid motels and empty highways. Sleep comes rarely, and when it does, it is never deep. She is always there, somewhere in the periphery of my life, a shadow at the edges of reality. I have tried to live a normal life, but her presence is a constant reminder that some things cannot be escaped. Even in moments of happiness and the warmth of daylight, I feel her gaze, waiting for night to return, for me to be alone for the next encounter. One winter night, I found myself in an abandoned farmhouse while visiting a friend in rural Vermont. The house was old, condemned, the kind of place that locals avoided. I wandered inside, curiosity getting the better of me. As I explored, I felt it immediately, the same oppressive presence I had come to know so well. Then, in a corner of the dusty living room, I saw her. She was sitting in a chair, motionless, staring at me. Her eyes were deeper than I remembered, more hollow, more knowing. She whispered again, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Leave." I ran, tripping over broken floorboards, heart hammering, and didn't stop until I was back in my friend's car. It is not just fear she brings. It is an awareness of mortality, a reminder that some things are beyond comprehension. She exists in a space between the living and the dead, a presence that is felt as much as it is seen. She is not violent, not in the traditional sense, but her influence is inescapable, an erosion of peace and normalcy. Even now, decades after that first night on the road, I feel her presence. I have tried to write it off, to rationalize it as stress or lingering trauma, but the truth is undeniable. She is real, and she is waiting. Waiting for the next sleepless night, the next moment of solitude, the next instant when fear takes hold, and she can make her presence known again. I have learned to live with it, but it is a tenuous existence. The whisper of her word, the hint of movement in the dark, the shadow at the edge of my vision, it all reminds me that she is never far away. And I know, with an unshakable certainty, that no matter where I go or how I try to avoid her, she will find me again. Always. Sometimes. Late at night, I can feel her in the room with me. A cold draft brushing the back of my neck, the faintest sound of footsteps on floorboards that should be silent. I try to close my eyes and sleep, but even then I feel her watching, waiting, patient and eternal. The word comes again in a whisper, almost a melody, almost a threat. Leave. And I know that the only way to survive is to keep moving, to never stop, to never rest. She is part of my life now, a shadow that cannot be ignored, a constant companion that reminds me of the fragility of existence and the thin line between the living and the dead. There is no ending to this, no resolution, only the ongoing knowledge that she is out there, watching, waiting, and that every sleepless night is hers as much as mine. She is a ghost, yes, but also a reminder. Some encounters are not meant to be survived, only endured, and some presences are never gone, no matter how far you run. Even now, as I sit in a well-lit room in a city far from that first road, I feel her presence. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper in the silence. She is waiting, as she always has been, as she always will be, for the next ghostly and sleepless night. Story the end. It was the kind of night that immediately makes you question every sound, every shadow. I had moved into a small 2-bedroom house in rural Pennsylvania after finishing college, looking for a quiet place to start my career. The town was tiny, population barely over 1,000, surrounded by dense forests and farmlands that stretched for miles. The house itself was old, built in the 1920s, and though it had been renovated over the years, you could still feel the weight of its age in the creaking floorboards, the drafty windows, and the odd smell of wood that had aged too long. I was excited to live alone, thinking I would finally have the peace and quiet to myself. But I quickly realized there was a difference between solitude and isolation. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my belongings, set up my workspace, and tried to settle into the rhythm of life there. The neighbors were friendly enough, though distant. I rarely saw them outside. I had a small group of friends from college who called or texted occasionally, but most nights were spent alone. The house was quiet during the day, except for the usual groans and settling noises of an old structure and the occasional creak of a branch brushing the siding in the wind. It was the third night when things began to feel off. I had gone to bed later than usual, around midnight, reading a book in the living room until I felt sleepy. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the old windows, and the moonlight cast strange shadows across the wooden floor. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. At first, I assumed it was my imagination. After all, I lived alone. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, approaching from the direction of the guest bedroom. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, but the pattern of the footsteps was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be natural. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously crept toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The light cut across the hallway, illuminating nothing but the empty corridor and closed bedroom doors. I waited, straining my ears, and then I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Get out!" I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably human. I shone the flashlight toward the source, but nothing was there. I felt a cold draft brush past me, even though all the windows were closed. My first instinct was to run, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. I whispered, "Who's there?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the whisper came again, this time closer, more urgent. "Leave. Now." I bolted for the living room, fumbling for my phone to call someone. No signal. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was stress, fatigue, and the eerie isolation playing tricks on my mind. I turned on every light in the house, hoping that visibility would dispel the fear. But it didn't. The air seemed heavier, colder, as if the house itself had shifted. I could hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls, low and rhythmic, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, lights on, door locked, flashlight in hand. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. The wind howled outside, carrying the faint scent of earth and something metallic. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted, my mind racing with what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? It wasn't until the second night that the experience escalated. I had managed to fall asleep briefly, only to wake around 2 a.m. to a soft tapping at my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the shadows outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was drumming their fingers. My windows faced the backyard, which opened into a dense stand of trees, and no one could have been out there without me noticing. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed, swinging the door open cautiously. Nothing. Just the cold wind and the rustle of leaves. I returned to bed, heart racing, when I heard it again, this time a voice, closer, more urgent. You shouldn't be here. The words were clear, low, and filled with malice. I sat up, paralyzed with fear. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but I felt frozen, trapped in my own home. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the foot of my bed, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, thin, and humanoid, but it radiated an unnatural presence. Its form flickered like smoke caught in a beam of light, and I could sense its gaze, piercing and malevolent. I don't remember moving. I only remember the sudden adrenaline surge as I found myself bolting out of the house, grabbing my keys and running to my car in the rain. The night was cold, the storm making it nearly impossible to see, and I drove to the nearest town without a destination in mind, shaking uncontrollably. I ended up in a 24-hour diner, sipping coffee and trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The waitress noticed my state and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, then told her about the house, the footsteps, the voices, the figure. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded knowingly. That house, she said quietly, has a history. People don't stay there long. Something happened there years ago. A woman disappeared and they never found her. Some say she never left. I stayed at the diner until daylight, then returned to my apartment in town, unable to face the house. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling me back, drawing me into its history, its unrest. Finally, I decided to confront it, to return and face whatever it was that lingered there. I drove back one evening, bringing with me a friend for support. We arrived at the house just before nightfall. The house looked ordinary in the daylight, almost comforting, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched across the rooms like dark fingers. I tried to rationalize everything, explaining to my friend that it was probably drafts, noises, and my overactive imagination. We settled in, lights on, and began talking to distract ourselves. But as night fell fully, the feeling of being watched returned, heavy and oppressive. It started subtly, a soft creak from the hallway, a whisper barely audible in the living room. Then the footsteps came, slow and deliberate, circling the rooms. My friend froze, and I could see the fear in their eyes. The temperature dropped sharply, and our breath became visible. The scratching started again, louder this time, echoing through the house. Then, we saw it together. A figure emerged from the shadows near the fireplace, a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair long and matted, her face obscured by shadow. She didn't move toward us, but her presence filled the room with an unbearable weight. She lifted her head slightly, revealing hollow eyes, dark and endless, staring directly at us. The air seemed to vibrate with her voice as she whispered in unison to both of us, "Leave." I grabbed my friend's hand, and we ran, nearly tripping over each other in our haste. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, doors locked, rain pelting down. We didn't speak much on the drive, both of us shaken to the core. I realized then that this wasn't a prank, a trick of the mind, or a coincidence. Something truly restless lingered in that house, tied to the past, unwilling to move on. After that night, I never returned. I sold the house to someone else, hoping they would be fortunate enough to ignore its presence or dismiss it as folklore. Friends told me I should have investigated further, tried to contact paranormal experts, but I refused. Some things, I realized, are better left alone. Even now, years later, I feel its pull in the quiet moments of the night. Sometimes I dream of the woman, of hollow eyes and whispered warnings, and I wake in a cold sweat, heart racing. The experience changed me, left a permanent mark, a reminder that there are places in this world that are alive in ways we cannot understand, where the past lingers and waits, patient and relentless. Occasionally, I drive past the area where the house once stood. From the road, I can still see it, abandoned and decaying, shrouded in mist and shadow. I never stop for long. I never get out of the car. Because deep down, I know that the presence I felt there never truly leaves. It waits, watching, whispering. And if you listen closely on a sleepless night, you might hear it too, calling your name, warning you to leave before it's too late. Even now, when the wind rattles the windows of my own apartment, I glance at the shadows and feel the weight of those hollow eyes on me, as if the restless woman has followed me, tethered to my memory, unwilling to release me from the fear she instilled. I have learned that some nights are better spent awake, listening, aware, and never alone. And every stormy night, when darkness and wind converge, I can still hear her soft, haunting whisper, "Leave." Story the end. It started on a chilly November evening in rural Pennsylvania when I first moved into the small farmhouse that had been empty for years. I had inherited it from a distant uncle I barely knew, a man who lived a solitary life on the outskirts of a town most people didn't even know existed. The house was old, built in the late 1800s with faded white siding, a sagging porch, and windows that rattled in even the mildest wind. My first thought when I saw it was that it needed work. Plumbing, electrical, insulation, but something about it drew me in. I told myself the isolation would be perfect for focusing on writing my novel. I had no idea how quickly that solitude would become unbearable. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I kept the lights on and a fire burning, trying to chase off the eerie silence. The house creaked naturally, as old houses do, and I kept reminding myself that it was just settling, nothing more. But around 2 a.m., I heard a soft knock from the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I called out, "Hello?" No response. The knock continued for a few more seconds before stopping abruptly. I tried to sleep, telling myself I'd probably imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next week, small things began to happen. Objects would be out of place. Books on the floor that I was certain I had left on the shelf, dishes in the sink that I had cleaned and put away. At first, I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, but then the whispers began. Faint voices, unintelligible at first, coming from the corners of the house. I would hear my name being whispered, soft and slow, almost coaxing. I told myself it was the wind, drafts through the old windows. But my cat, normally indifferent to everything, would hiss and arch her back, staring at the corners of rooms as if seeing something I couldn't. One night, about 10 days after moving in, I was sitting in the living room, reading. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, a woman standing at the foot of the staircase, barely visible in the dim glow. But as I focused, she became clearer. Pale, long dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face, and a dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and unblinking. I froze, unable to move. She lifted her hands slowly, as if beckoning me toward her. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I bolted to the kitchen, then out into the cold night, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible after that. I would sit in my car outside the house for hours, trying to convince myself that it was exhaustion or imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Over the next few nights, her appearances became more frequent. She would appear in mirrors, in shadows, at the edge of my vision, and always the whispers followed. My name, sometimes repeated over and over, other times just a single drawn-out syllable that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I began researching the history of the house. Local records and newspaper archives revealed unsettling details. Several families had lived there, none for long. There were reports of disappearances, particularly of women and children, all in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One story stood out. A young woman named Eleanor had lived in the house in the 1890s and vanished during a snowstorm. Her body was never found. The locals whispered that she had been cursed or trapped, doomed to roam the house she had once called home. The more I learned, the more I realized that she was trying to communicate. The objects moving, the whispers, the appearances, they were all forms of contact. But what she wanted remained unclear, and every attempt to interact only made the encounters more intense. Doors would slam, Windows would shatter, and I would find scratches on the floors and walls, as if someone or something was trying to leave a message I couldn't decipher. One particularly harrowing night, I was awakened by a loud crash from upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint outline of a figure at the end. It was Eleanor. She was closer now, her presence overwhelming, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. Her eyes, hollow and endless, met mine, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like the weight of the house itself pressing down on me. She raised her hand, pointing toward the basement door. I felt compelled to follow, though every instinct screamed at me not to. I descended the basement stairs slowly. The air was damp and cold, filled with the smell of earth and decay. At the far end, the wall was lined with strange marks, scratches, claw-like gouges, and stains that looked like old blood. My flashlight flickered as I approached, illuminating more of the wall. That's when I understood. This was where Eleanor had died, or at least where something terrible had happened to her. Her spirit was bound to this place, trapped by pain and loss, unable to move on. From that night on, the hauntings escalated. She would appear in broad daylight sometimes, though briefly, always at the edge of my vision. At night, the whispers became cries, pleading, warning, sometimes angry. I could no longer stay in the house alone. Friends who visited refused to spend the night, claiming they saw her too. The physical sensations became more pronounced, sudden chills, objects thrown across rooms, doors slamming shut, the sound of footsteps pacing the hallways. Every night became a battle to maintain my sanity. I reached out to a local historian and paranormal investigator, hoping for guidance. The investigator was an older man with years of experience who had dealt with cases like mine before. He suggested a ritual to attempt to free Eleanor's spirit, a combination of prayers, offerings, and symbolic gestures meant to release her from the pain that kept her tethered. The night of the ritual, the house seemed to come alive. Shadows moved unnaturally, the temperature dropped drastically, and her form appeared repeatedly, watching, judging, almost testing me. By the end of the night, there was a shift, an easing, a quietness that I had not felt in weeks. Eleanor no longer appeared with the same intensity. The whispers faded, though the occasional creak or flicker of light reminded me she was still present, lingering. Despite the apparent reprieve, I could not remain. The emotional toll was too great. I sold the farmhouse and moved to a small apartment in the city. I thought distance would sever the connection, but it did not entirely. Occasionally, in mirrors or reflections, I catch glimpses of her figure standing silently. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faintest whisper of my name, barely audible over the hum of the city. It is a reminder that some presences do not easily let go. I have come to understand that spirits like Eleanor are not inherently malevolent, but they are persistent. Bound by tragedy and unresolved events, they remain tethered, searching, observing, waiting. My encounters have left me wary, cautious, and deeply respectful of the unseen forces that may exist just beyond our perception. Even now, years later, the memory of her hollow eyes, the chill of her presence, and the constant whisper of her voice remain vivid. Vivid. She is a reminder that the world is larger, stranger, and more unsettling than we often admit. I will never live alone in an old house again. I will never ignore the stories of those who claim to have seen the unseen. And I will never forget the sleepless nights spent in the presence of Eleanor, the spirit who showed me that sometimes the past does not rest quietly, and some souls, no matter how lost, will always seek recognition, even from those who barely know their name. Story, the end.